The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to Your Hour with APA Virginia. My name is Martina James Nally, and I'm APA Virginia staff. First and foremost, as we do every month, we have to thank the Berkeley Group for making this webinar series possible. Their support and collaboration really brings a lot of great presentations to your screens every month as you join us the fourth Monday of every month at noon. So thank you again to the Berkeley Group for all you do for APA Virginia. Just a reminder, these webinars are recorded. As you can see on your screen, this is our APA Virginia's YouTube page. Once the session or once the webinar is completed, we then post it. You can find all the information about CM credits in the notes on the posted webinar. Feel free to share this page, with colleagues or any other professional affiliations that you feel would benefit from it. The more we can share, the better we find it. Upcoming webinars, we do have some open months over the next couple months. And if you're interested in presenting or you have a topic that you would like to see a little bit more about, please feel free to send us any ideas you have at info@apavirginia.com. So again, info@apavirginia.com. We're always looking for new and interesting presentations, and we're always excited to be able to share those with you. Again, CM credits are available for this webinar as you watch it live. And then again, once it's recorded and posted, you can get CM credits for watching it once it's been posted. If you have any questions about that or the credit number, feel free to contact us again at that info@apavirginia.com. As we get into the presentation, you may have questions. As we do each month, we ask you to hold your questions till the end or type your questions in the question box on your control panel. About 5 to 10 minutes before the end of the hour, I'll come back and provide our presenters with those questions, and we'll go through and get them answered. And we'll also be able to share any of the presentations and materials with you post presentation as we post it on our YouTube page. There will be a follow-up email that goes out with all of this information for everybody who participated. So with that, I'm going to hand the presentation off to Brian Sweats and Emily Crow, and I will let them take it from here.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Sweats. I am the Comp Plan Manager for the City of Portsmouth. I'm going to handle the beginning of the presentation. I'm going to talk for hopefully about 15 minutes or so, and then I'm going to pass it off to Emily, and then she will send it back to me at the end, and we hopefully will leave enough time for questions and answers with everyone. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started. I want to show you if this will respond. There we go. So let me walk you through a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. The first thing I want to do is talk about the background for our comprehensive planning efforts for our Build One Portsmouth plan. I want to talk to you about what we thought about and what we decided we wanted to accomplish before we even got started with the whole comp plan process. Highlight some findings from some preliminary studies that we did. I'm going to talk a little bit about the RFP that we drew up and why we did it the way that we did. Then we will get to Emily. She's going to I'll walk you through the plan itself with the content and how it works. And then finally at the end, I'll come back and talk a little bit about tracking the implementation of the plan since it was adopted last November and some of the environmental practices and partnerships that we've established in that time to try to meet the goals that we've highlighted in the comp plan. So first, we did an extensive amount of research looking at not just other comprehensive plans, but all sorts of plans, trying to figure out what exactly do we want to accomplish, what do we want to look like, what do we want to include. As we started looking through plans, and these are just examples of places that we looked, on your left is a page from Baltimore's disaster preparedness plan. On your top right, this is from Victoria, British Columbia's comprehensive plan, and bottom right is a page from Cincinnati's comprehensive plan. We looked through a number of different documents because we wanted to try to come up with something that fit what we wanted to accomplish, which was a limited narrative. We did not want this to read like an encyclopedia. We wanted to have good, clear visuals and maps and charts, make it more interesting and more informative to view as opposed to reading it from cover to cover. And we wanted to make sure that we had a solid implementation plan in place. One of the questions that we would get at the beginning of the comp plan was, well, what happened with the current one? Why aren't you using it anymore? And we wanted to highlight that we are actually accomplishing things, and we are going to lay out what we want to accomplish in the future. We also identified things that we want to avoid. Again, we didn't want this to be too long or too wordy. We didn't want to get bogged down in jargon and planner speak. We wanted this to be a tool that anyone could pick up and use, not just people in the planning department. Another benefit of doing this research was it gave us an opportunity to identify firms that we thought were doing really good work, so that in the future we could try to find ways to work with these people. And I'll come back and mention that again later on in the presentation. Not only did we look at the kind of form of the plan itself, but we talked a lot about the ideas that we wanted the plan to include. And the most important thing was we wanted this plan to be focused on resiliency. But when we were talking about resiliency, we made sure to explain that this is not just in the emergency management side of things or say the environmental side of things, but this is a whole way of looking at creating, implementing, and adapting public policy. That this is an iterative process where you constantly have to be looking at what it is you're doing, measuring it, examining how your plans, your strategies, your tactics are responding to situations that is it working the way that you wanted it to? And then if it's not, we need to be going back and changing things so that our policies are actually being effective on the ground. So before we start with the plan and into the beginning of the comp plan process itself, we undertook a number of studies with some different firms. I'm highlighting some of the firms here on the slide. I'm going to walk you through some what I thought were interesting findings that helped to inform the plan itself. So first, we worked with Weldon Cooper Center at UVA for a demographic analysis. This was the first project that we undertook as part of the updating process. We wanted to look at, what do we look like currently demographically? What do our trends look like? And then we want to analyze and evaluate that data so we could focus our comp plan goals. Some of this stuff is normal to any sort of comp plan process, like say looking at your population. And I will admit that at first I thought that this might be kind of an exercise that was more time consuming than anything else. But it turns out that little things like looking at your population can actually lead to specific goals and strategies. As we got into this, it turned out that our city council had been discussing the fact that our population had dipped under 100,000 and that they wanted a specific goal to get the city's population back up over 100,000 people. So it turned out that our comp plan, we were going to have to look at identifying strategies for increasing our population specifically and not just as an outgrowth of other policies. Getting deeper into the data, this is a chart showing the household income of commuters into and out of Portsmouth. Looking at something like this told us that, wait a minute, the people who live in Portsmouth and work in Portsmouth tend to have the lowest paying jobs, and that people who are working at some of our biggest employers where they're making the most money, like say our Naval Hospital or shipyard, those people are leaving Portsmouth and just commuting into the city to work. And so that informs the comp plan where we have to figure out, well, how do we convince those people to live in Portsmouth so that we can start keeping some of those good paying jobs here in the city. This is a map showing the taxable value per acre of property in Portsmouth. You'll notice that the areas along the water in green are the lowest taxable value, and those because most of those are owned by the federal government. So some of our most valuable land is not controlled or taxable by the city. Also, you'll notice on the right-hand side of the map, the area in red, that's our most valuable area. That's our downtown, which is our economic and cultural center. This is also a part of the city that is severely threatened by flooding. And so as we undertook the comp plan process, we knew we had to think about this question. What do we do with this downtown? Are we protecting it? Do we start thinking about retreating? How do those conversations go? Really is going to drive strategy for us over the next 20, 30, 40 years. I found this chart to be fascinating. It was showing net migration into and out of Portsmouth, and what we found was that people who are in their 20s and 30s or young 30s before they start having families and children are moving into the city, but just about every other age group is moving out. So we know that, okay, we have young people who are coming here, but then how do we capture them? Why are they leaving? Where are they going? And that became a central focus of our comp plan as well. We worked with the Virginia Modeling Analysis and Simulation Center out of Old Dominion University in partnership with our health department. We conducted a scientifically valid survey of Portsmouth citizens regarding their opinions on climate change and sea level rise. And we also asked about some health characteristics so that we could get some data for the health department. We knew if we wanted to focus on resiliency, and that because we're now required under Virginia law to address sea level rise and climate change in comprehensive plans, we had to make sure that this wasn't going to be controversial with our citizens. And it turns out that it wasn't controversial at all. Just about everyone in the city believed that sea level rise was occurring, and not just that it was occurring, but that there was going to be a significant amount of it over time, so that we knew we could get political support for including strategies and tactics to try to tackle sea level rise. When we got into the data, you could start to see why people believe this. This was a measure of frequency of street flooding, and you'll notice that in the dark blue, these are people who have their street flooded more than once a month. So you can see that this is a major issue for our citizens here. We went through, like I said, a number of questions related to people's experiences and their opinions, their health characteristics. We boiled all of this down and we created this vulnerability heat map. This encapsulates everything from people's experience with flooding to health characteristics to family and social network to opinions as whether we can even attempt to tackle climate change and sea level rise. And we put all this together and we found areas of the city that we know are hot spots that we need to focus on protecting going forward. This map also helps to illustrate a point that we had not totally considered, but we understood much better after going through this, that our problem is not tidal flooding, which is something that gets the predominant amount of media attention, especially being near Virginia Beach and Norfolk. Our situation is much more influenced by rainfall and stormwater driven events. And that really changed our focus on how we had to go about protecting our citizens. We happen to be working with our economic development department on a market analysis of our downtown area with 100 strategic partners at the same time. We got some very good information out of their research efforts. For example, there's been a conversation amongst our political leadership for a long time now about whether a second downtown hotel would fit with the market. And we found that yes, there is a large number of unaccommodated room nights, and it's been increasing for the most part over time. So we do need to figure out a way to get another higher end hotel down here. Conversely, the cost of office space per square foot is declining rapidly. And if we're looking at trying to create a dynamic mixed use environment in our downtown, but there's really no market for office, well then what does that look like? And that was something that we talked about during the comp plan. We found that there was a lot of pent up demand for multifamily units, which makes sense when you consider that we have a lot of young people moving into Portsmouth. So you put all of this together, that there's little demand for office, there is strong demand for multifamily. We know retail is weak, all over the country. So how do we create a multifamily environment that can support the existing retail, but if we don't have the vibrancy of office workers moving around downtown, leaving the office to get lunch, hanging out after work, how does that all work? What does it look like? We worked with Tischler Bice during the comprehensive plan. One question that they looked at for us was what economic sectors should we be focusing on in the future? And so this chart really breaks down what those sectors are and whether they're strong, whether they're weak, whether they're growing, whether they're shrinking. And we turn that into a location quotient. And we use that to help us answer the question, well, what should we be focusing on when we are trying to bring economic development to Portsmouth? Do we focus on our strengths or do we focus on our weaknesses? Again, these are topics of conversation with our stakeholders and our citizens as we establish goals and strategies and tactics during the comp plan. We also worked with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. They helped us to model the impacts of past storms and what those will look like in the future given different sea level rise scenarios. So for example, this map on the left was from Hurricane Isabel. The areas in blue are places that flooded back in 2003. The spaces in red are buildings that flooded. And we said, well, what would that hurricane look like in 2040 given, say, 1.5 feet of sea level rise? And we used a number of different sea level rise scenarios. I'll show those to you in the next slide. But you can see here in the map on the right the much greater extent of flooding that we'll be seeing, the larger number of buildings. And a lot of those buildings are in the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. Again, a major employer for the city, a place that has to be protected. If you zoom in on that area, you'll see not just the shipyard, but the residential area on the bottom center of the map is one of our historic districts, neighborhood called Craddock. Areas in blue are places that are already flooded. As you go from green to red, you'll see flooding getting progressively worse based on different sea level rise scenarios. So we can use these maps throughout the city to calculate all manner of economic and fiscal impacts from disasters and flooding. We can use it to study future development and land use decisions. And we can combine this with our past survey work to identify vulnerable populations so we can create better emergency response plans. This is, I cut and pasted the kind of work requirements from the RFP that we put out for the comp plan. My point here isn't to say that these are the ones that you should pick, but more to highlight the perspective that we had, which was that we wanted to be very specific about what we wanted to accomplish. We wanted to establish from the very beginning what we were expecting from the consultant that we ended up hiring. And we wanted to highlight the fact that Portsmouth tends to be a poor city, that our budget realities have to be considered when we are identifying strategies and tactics. We can't have, all manner of, say, flood wall protection around the city. Something like that is not going to be viable. When I mentioned before that we were looking around at firms and work products trying to figure out what it is that we want to accomplish, that helped to give us an idea of some of the firms that we want to work with. And so I'd recommend once you have your RFP drawn up and it's approved, don't just send it to the normal places where we advertise. Send it directly to firms that you found whose work that you like and you might want to work with. Don't give yourself the opportunity to miss out on working with someone because maybe they don't find out about the fact that you have this RFP out there. As part of that RFP, we highlighted this document from APA, Sustaining Places Best Practices for Comprehensive Plans. We made sure during the RFP and in the interview process and throughout the comp plan update that we wanted to draw on best planning practices. We wanted to make sure that we were using the right processes, that our plans had the right attributes. We actually used this as a scorecard at the end of the process after we had completed our first draft or first final draft to make sure that we were meeting the guidelines recommended by seasoned planners. Speaking of scoring, this is part of a scoring matrix for the consultant applications that I created. Your goals as a planner may differ from the goals of your finance department. And so don't leave it up to them to be the one who is picking the plan for you or picking the consultant for you. Make sure that they're working on what you are valuing and what's important to you. This is only part of the matrix, but again, it's here to highlight that make sure that you do as much as you can to get the people that you want based on the criteria that you set, not that someone else has set for you. And during that selection process, try to make it easy for consultants where you can. Do you have an online application option? Is that, so you don't have to have 15 large binders printed out, which becomes, problematic for the consultant. It's just extra cost. If there is a pre-application meeting necessary, if people are claiming for one, make sure that you offer something like that. Offer virtual interviews. Again, you're saving the consultant time, money, and effort in having to get to you for something that might not be guaranteed. So anything, again, that you can do to make it easier for them gives you more quality applicants. And finally, one thing I would recommend is when you're doing the interviews, make sure that you're interviewing the people that you're going to be working with. You don't necessarily want to hear from the partner who comes in and sells the plan and then is never on that work product again. Work with and talk with the people who you're going to be interacting with on a regular basis, because those are the people who you're going to have to spend 1.5 to 2 years of your life with. You want them to be someone that you trust. And finally, while all of this is going on, it's recommended building internal support within City Hall. You're meeting with people either individually or maybe in small working groups because they tend to work together. You're helping to build and establish relationships if you didn't previously have those. I met a lot of people who I did not know previously, and I felt that that really helped us to gain support for the plan. You know, I sat down and I talked about what they wanted to accomplish. I gathered their plans, read them, and then followed up on their priorities, showing that I felt that their work was important. And then I updated them along the way as the plan was proceeding to let them know how the work that they were doing was being included. So that concludes the beginning of my presentation. I'm going to go switch it to Emily now, and she's going to walk you through how the plan works.
Hello, everyone. I'm Emily Crow. I am a senior planner and project manager for McBride Dell Clarion. We have done a lot of Virginia planning over the years, but we are based here in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I appreciate everything Brian just shared with you all. We were selected to help the city draft their plan, and I think it was a great opportunity and kind of led to, I think, what is a very innovative product that kind of carries on the legacy of things that in the past we've called smart growth. Then, you know, a few years ago, and even with the sustainability scorecard, we started referring to it as sustainability, and now the key term that we're using is resiliency. And I think the theme is that we always, as planners and as long-range planners, we always want to be moving towards a vibrant, manageable future where we hope that you know, the future is better than the past we're leaving behind. And I think you know, I just want to share a little bit with you all about the process that we used and kind of some of the key to successes about that came out of Build One Portsmouth. So some of the things, and I think this holds true for long-range planning in general, and especially in Virginia with the state requirements and everything else. But Build One Portsmouth was kind of unique, and I think the thing about that was because resiliency was so important in the request for this process, the inclusivity and the iterative process was even more important. And it's not the shiny, glamorous part of planning, but it is so critical to how this plan succeeded. And it was essential to building that resiliency into the process as a major outcome. Because of that, I think the other things that we looked at is we can't just be resilient in one area. And so rather than looking at our planning topics as elements, as transportation or economic development, is we had to thematically aggregate all of those topics together. And so when we were working with the community and the public, that was really important, but also talking to the different departments and the agencies that would be implementing this plan, it was really important. We also think that part of being resilient is writing a better plan. And Brian mentioned this about, you know, making sure that your plan is something that anyone can pick up, and it can provide guidance to them about the direction of your community. We also used peer review in this process, and I think that had some very good outcomes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then I think the idea, again, is kind of ties in with writing a better plan, but it also is critical, I think, to the concept of resiliency and sustainability, is you have to access the experts, but you have to empower the community to make those changes. And so it is about that process. And I think a lot of us as planners, we deal with those kinds of things on a daily basis. A lot of times as the planner, you are that person that kind of connects your community to the different areas of expertise. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the iterative process. The key thing with our process was about building relationships between the citizens and the businesses in Portsmouth and the elected officials and administrative staff. That there had been some inconsistency or maybe a lack of understanding about the past plan and how it had been updated. We had had some turnover in elected officials, and it really wasn't clear. We didn't have a good gauge about, you know, are the old planning recommendations, are they still in line with what the community is wanting and needing? And so we use that opportunity as an educational opportunity for the people who ultimately were going to have to implement this, but also to engage the community and make them a part of this, setting us up for those possible implementation successes in the future. It's all about, you know, that citizen buy-in so that, you know, everyone in the community feels like they own this plan and they want to stick to it. To do that, and as Brian pointed out, we had a pretty broad scope in the request. And so we put together a team that included outreach and engagement experts. Planning Next and the Miles Agency were key players in that aspect. Building excitement about what's going on in the community. We had Tischler Weiss on our team to help with market and also fiscal concerns. And so they really helped us when it comes to the sustainability and resiliency elements. They were integral in helping us identify the paths that we needed to have some kind of balance in order to be sustainable. Clarion Associates is an affiliate of McBride Dale Clarion, and they were very important in the implementation component of this in terms of what are kind of emerging trends and topics that can help communities implement their comprehensive plans. They also have a strong background in sustainability and resiliency, both in code work and in comprehensive planning. So they had a key role here. We also brought on a kind of a special team member, the National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center out of the University of North Carolina, Asheville. They're known as NEMAC. They have done resiliency and storm preparedness based on climate change. So they do the modeling, but then they also have toolkits that were created that anyone can access. And basically, they helped us identify where some of our critical challenges were, and then helped us develop some policies on how that could be integrated into either disaster preparedness or just the general land use planning component of this process. Kimberly Horn was on the team and assisted us with the transportation elements. and that was pretty important in regards to all of the street flooding and everything else that Brian shared with you, kind of about how people get around the community. And then there's also the kind of the response to that is when there is an emergency related to water and storms, how do we deal with evacuations and getting in and through the city? And then originally we had David Gottschalk on the team, and he was slated to do some initial review on the sustainability. Unfortunately, he did pass during the process, and we brought David Rouse on, who was with APA at the time, and he helped us review the plan against the sustainability scorecard. And that was all, I think, really important in this process, is having the experts who were familiar with the city, who were familiar with these processes, and being able to kind of, again, access those experts. I also am showing you here all of the great support that we had from both the Planning Commission members and the City Council throughout this process. We didn't have a formal steering committee. We used the Planning Commission as the group to review this. So we were meeting very regularly with Planning Commission, and they really did help us kind of craft this and listen to what the citizens were sharing, and put that together. And then we had great support from the City Council, and they were all very highly engaged in this process. And we had the planning staff who all participated, and as Brian mentioned, he reached out to all of the other departments and staff and really made it an encouraging effort to get everyone on the same page for this process. We ran several rounds of public engagement. We had a blend of, kind of the traditional meet around a table, talk about things, dots on maps that planners love. And we did a lot of work that way. We had almost 200 people participate in our first round of meetings that way. We had several online engagement opportunities, and we ran a variety of open houses. But it was through these kind of tabletop traditional meetings where we met a lot of people who were very interested in finding ways to work on special projects that might help make improvements in their neighborhoods. And I think this was really critical to this process, is the number of people that showed up, how engaged they really wanted to be, and reaching an audience of younger people. We did a lot of our work at the community college, and so we had an opportunity to meet people and have them come in and look at the plan that maybe wouldn't have normally had access to it. And that was a really great experience. The planning process itself, as Brian showed you, because we were focused on resiliency, it was important to make sure that we had an iterative process that kind of combined that technical research and background with the public engagement and activation of the community. And so we did work through it took us about 2 years exactly. And we started with the research analysis. We did the diagnosis of the existing plan and what the accomplishments had been. We pulled in the market analysis, did some land use analysis on vacant and underutilized land. And then we did the vision part of things and built what is that planning framework going to look like, and how, what are our goals, and how do we put this all together for the future. And then we had a pretty lengthy drafting and review session, and ultimately what ended up coming out of this process, and I think we were all very proud of this, is a plan that was very well accepted and very well vetted so that by the time council was hearing this for adoption, neither Brian nor I were in attendance, because we had built enough trust in this process that they didn't even really need us there, that was our goal, is to create a plan and a document that kind of outlived the process and was that guide for the future. So those key elements that I think it's just important to point out again is we audited the existing plan, because most communities have a comprehensive plan, but we don't always, we've accomplished things. It's making sure that it's staying up to date, but we don't eliminate the things that are really important and intrinsic to that community. We did extensive trend and data analysis, and we pulled in the things that Brian had mentioned that had predated the comp plan. And then we also completed some additional market and sea level rise, flood hazard, and then we did a lot of asset mapping as well, which was really important when it comes to the resiliency and the emergency preparedness, and making sure that we know where those things are in the community. And then the process itself really was about getting that public input and that prioritization about what is most important for the people of Portsmouth. So one of the other things that I think is really important in modern planning is the idea that we have to take our issues out of silos, that we can't constantly just think about land use and then in one room, and then have another group of people talking about economic development and another, and the transportation guys talking somewhere else. The purpose of a comprehensive plan is to put all of those pieces together and create a framework under which those decisions can be made. And so something that's important about Build One Portsmouth is the actual interactive structure of the plan really allowed us to do something kind of innovative in that because it's using interactive links, we didn't have to write it in a linear fashion. So anytime I talked about a focus area where we had a bunch of special recommendations, there were always ways to link to transportation or land use recommendations for those areas. And I think that's really important for us to be thinking about in this environment of needing to be flexible and adaptable in order to be sustainable. So the approach we took was, you have your traditional elements, your population growth, economic development, public facilities, etc. But in Build One Portsmouth, what we did is we talked about the values of the community, and we did a couple surveys to identify that, and we found out that it was our people, our pride, our place, and our potential. And what we came up with there was a couple of themes that really seemed to be driving all of this. And it was about being a thriving community, about being an evolving community, about being resilient, and about being equitable in those decisions. And those are all, I think, fundamental things to the concept of sustainability and resiliency. And that led to a vision statement. And this is what the city was aspiring to. This is what set that tone for the whole comprehensive plan. And this is how the plan ended up being organized. So we use that technology, that interactive technology that we have, either creating a web-based plan, or in our case, we did a PDF, and it's interactive online. But we have a strategic plan, a geographic plan, and then the implementation tools and plan. And that's part of what I talked about in writing a better plan. Is Brian pointed out, we wanted to dispense with the things that only the bureaucrats and the planners care about, and make this a manual for the elected and appointed officials and the people of the city, so that anyone could read this story and figure out where the community needed to be heading. This involves having a little bit more of a user manual, but it's all fairly intuitive. And again, like I said, we did a non-linear structure to it, and this is facilitated through interactive links and menus. The strategic plan, I think, was very important, and it's what we developed first. We had a great deal of discussion about the vision and then the goals, which were harvested from the previous plan and created fresh and new based on the input that we had had to date. Each goal has a series of strategies that go with it, and each strategy has a group of tactics. All of those are then linked back to maps and definitions and implementation tools to basically set the stage or the framework for this plan. The geographic plan contains more of what we traditionally think of as our plan elements. So we have community character, future land use. As I said, we did an extensive study because the city of Portsmouth is landlocked, and Brian showed you the values of land. You know, each acre of land in the city is very important in terms of its future use. And so we looked at vacant and underutilized land. We looked at the historic resources. Again, this is kind of is the asset mapping portion of things. And we looked at things like the flooding and some of the other natural resources as well. I think there were eight or so different topics in the geographic plan. Then, as was most, this was the outcome. We wanted an action-oriented implementation plan. And so this became a fairly complex element of Build One Portsmouth, but we really wanted to focus on those initial actions. What are the things that, as this plan is adopted, are the immediate next steps? And so we did a short-term work plan that took us out 5-10 years, and certainly understanding that there would be annual reviews of this to track progress. And that was the other thing, is maintaining the plan. Is once this is adopted, it's not just done. It's really important to look at the plan every year. If you don't need to update it every year, that's fine, but at least consider it and add the things that maybe have come up in the previous year that weren't anticipated at the time the plan was adopted. We also knew that it was really important to identify funding and resources. So we did a pretty thorough inclusion of the 2019 budget, and then also access to alternative funding sources that we were able to identify for the process. Then we had some other pieces that were more tool-oriented. Each tactic was assigned to a department. It was given a typology, so if it was a program or a regulatory tool, any of that, so that anyone reading this, whether Brian and I were there to explain it to them, they were going to be able to understand what was being suggested and how that needed to be carried out. We also listed specific tools, how, I may know what a capital improvement plan is, but someone else may not. And so making sure that that was included. But that's not the main body of the plan. So if I'm not interested in those things, I don't have to read through that. I can still figure out what our strategic approach is. This is the initial action prioritization. We talked about continuation of current efforts, the short-term efforts, and then kind of midterm and long range. One of, I think, the kind of top things was establishing a plan implementation committee, and I know Brian's going to talk a little bit more about implementation, so I will leave it at that. But this, I think, is something that is critically important, and then we also have a matrix that goes with this that tracks all of the tactics that were recommended in the plan. The peer review, which it's not a common thing in comprehensive plans. In Virginia, you do have the VDOT review that's required from the state. You also have your Department of Environmental Quality that will review for state environmental components. But in this case, having other planning consultants and then David Rouse, there's a real benefit to that, because instead of just getting my perspective or Brian's perspective on this, we were getting the professional perspective of other leading thinkers and planners. And it was really very valuable because it added a lot of useful tools. It gave us some clarity on organization and things that maybe we hadn't perceived as being quite as important. But really allowed us to elevate that. And I think it goes a long way to strengthen a comprehensive plan for a community if it has been reviewed from an outside source. So even if you approach your plan as an internal project, maybe looking to have an outside agency review it, or maybe the adjacent county planner or something like that could really add some benefit to your process. And then I think the final lesson learned from my perspective is that it's very important to access the experts but empower the community, because at the end of the day, there's only one Brian at the city of Portsmouth, and there's nearly 100,000 citizens. And there are limited resources, and how can we make better citizen planners and citizen developers out of the community? And so that's what was really important, is trying to find those connections that were going to make the community stronger and more resilient in themselves. And so one of the key ideas that came out was the Neighborhood Summit. That was an idea that would basically connect more time between the city and the citizens, and really give everyone a better chance to understand how the city works, but also have valuable input and maybe spawn some local projects that could kind of act as a gateway. We talked about the capital improvement program, because that's something that a lot of people ask about. You know, when is this road going to be improved? How do we deal with this? And so having that built into the plan was kind of a mechanism that it gives people that gateway to understanding how these different pieces work. And then tactical urbanism is also a part of that, that empowering the community. Is what are some of the things that the community really wants to get done that maybe the city doesn't have a huge budget to support, but if you can put a little bit of effort and resources into it and spend some time with that community, you might be able to get a small pilot project off the ground that doesn't cost a lot of money, but makes a huge difference within that neighborhood or area. And it makes people feel a lot better about their community, and maybe makes them more prone to engage in future improvement efforts. So those were some of the three things that we really wanted to point out and kind of work with people. One of the things that had come up during the process, we had some residents who pointed towards things that they thought could be key pilot projects and the idea of an eco district, which Austin has a couple of them. This was proposed by citizens as a potential pilot project that could take place in the early implementation stages to help reach the goals. So to make it a plan that's more resilient for the future, it's important to be committed to action, to track your progress, to make resources accessible and usable for everyone, and then look towards sustainability and land use, environment, economics, and community all together, and not just one or the other. So it looks like we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to change back over to Brian.
Thank you, Emily. All right, so I will try to run through this quickly so that we can get to everyone's questions. As far as Emily mentioned implementation, one of the things that we wanted to do was keep building on the branding that we'd built up from Build One Portsmouth. So we kept the project website, buildoneportsmouth.org, for anyone who's interested in going to see the plan or read about what we were doing. And as we implement parts of the plan, we want to highlight them here on the website since we've already got a dedicated user base. One goal that I have is to be able to create an open data portal for the city. There's cities like Austin and Nashville who have done pretty good jobs of this, but I would like to be able to put data out there that benchmarks our resiliency efforts, and so that we're providing transparency as to what we're doing. We're showing hopefully showing measurable results for policies that we're implementing. And by putting that data out there, not only can citizens view it to see what's going on, but we have built partnerships with a number of local research institutions, and so they have access to valuable data as well. Then, for example, here we go. This is a project with a company called Greenstream where they have installed flood sensors in areas of the city that we know flood. They will measure the depth of flooding at a given location and transmit that data to the cloud where it can then be accessible to anyone. And we're hoping that this will eventually be used, kind of like the way Waze or Google Maps uses traffic, so that you could incorporate flooding into people's mapping and travel work. And then that way people are able to better get around the city when we're having storms and disasters. I was going to talk about some of the work we're doing with a number of different entities that you can see here on the screen. This is just a selection of them. But in the interest of time, why don't I hold off on that, and instead we'll try to get to everyone's questions.
All right, thank you guys. Let me start. We have a couple questions, and if people have other questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. Our first question is, with the Virginia requirement for comp plan reviews every 5 years, how did you decide on a major overhaul versus a minor update?
So the last major plan that we did was in 2005, 2006. And we had not at that point addressed things like flooding, which is a huge issue. We have not talked about climate change or sea level rise, and just the concept of resiliency being something that really hit home with a lot of people who are involved in the process. We thought that in order to really kind of encapsulate and address all these really large issues, we were going to have to start over. So like Emily said, we did bring elements and strategies and tactics from the previous plan, things that were still relevant, especially as identified by the community and by our stakeholders. But again, to get to address those really big ideas, we just had we had to start over again.
All right, our next question is it's often difficult to attract meeting participants. What attracted so many people to engage? Flooding, meeting style, outreach, etc.
I think we made a conscious effort that we had to go to where people were, as opposed to just calling a meeting and hoping that people showed up. So we went out to as many festivals and events and gatherings as we could to let people know that this was happening. while we were there, we got people's input directly, so they didn't have to come to a special meeting if they didn't want to. They still had the opportunity to participate. We also created packets for people who wanted to volunteer, that they could have little meetings, say at their church or in their neighborhood or with their book club or what have you. So anything that we could do to get people to not have to add something to their calendar where we could go to them, that I think helped us to get as much input as we did.
Okay, I don't have any other questions at the moment. If anybody else, we'll give you another minute or so. If anybody else has any other questions, please send them our way by typing them in the chat box. In the meantime, was there anything else, Brian, you wanted to add about those partners? I know that was something that you said you'd hold off a little bit more because of questions, but since we don't have any, if there's, a few more minutes that you want to share, and I can pop in if we have another question pop up.
Sure. So for those of you who are not familiar with this DCRFR, it's the Commonwealth Center for Recurrent Flooding and Resiliency at Old Dominion. Yes, it's housed down here in Hampton Roads, but it is a statewide effort. There's a number of students who are getting involved in doing research and everything, and they provide a very valuable resource for people who are looking for some more technical expertise, but maybe don't want to go out and hire a consultant. Likewise, the William & Mary Law School's Virginia Coastal Policy Center, they did some work for us in looking at our zoning ordinance, helping us to understand state rules and regulations and what we could do to implement resilience activities given the constraints of being a Dillon Rule state. So they highlighted a number of factors for us. And Arcadis is a consultant that we have on call right now, and they are helping us with our resiliency efforts. The first thing we're working on right now is creating a benchmark of data, figuring out where we are as a city and on all manner of characteristics related to resiliency. But that way, once we have that data gathered and collected and put into one place, once we start implementing new policies and we start designing new projects, we can measure those against the existing basemark to see if what we're doing is successful. So for example, with green infrastructure projects, they're so dependent on the microgeography of where they are installed. So we want to be able to look at, as we try different things in different places, how successful are they, what lessons can we learn, and then how can we improve projects in the future.
We had another question pop up. Has anyone asked if there was a forecast year for implementation, like 2040 or 2050?
We're looking at 20 to 30 years as a timeline for the longer term goals. I imagine that the plan would get a major update before then, but trying to make ourselves more resilient in the face of climate change is a really long-term effort, and so we have to be thinking really long-term as we start designing policies and plans.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think, Brian, we talked a lot about that in the process of, do we pick a year and then plan towards that year, or is it really more, we know we have a long range, 2050, 100 years as we'd like to be keeping pace with this, but we have to start with those first steps. And so what can we do now to try to help move ourselves towards that future of being, able to adapt over time.
All right. Well, thank you guys both so much. We're right at the hour and want to be conscious of everybody's times. Thank you for presenting. Thanks for those who submitted questions. We will send a follow-up email out later this afternoon once the webinar has been posted, and then with any other follow-up information and access to our presenters in case you guys have further questions. But thank you again, Brian. Thank you again, Emily. And thank you guys for everybody who participated. And we will see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.